Okay, so we are going to talk about ATP and what ATP is. So, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and that is a form of energy that living organisms use. So, you may have heard of that before, but we are going to be talking about ATP as we transition to photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So, the structure of ATP has a nitrogenous base or nitrogen containing base, a five carbon sugar, and then three phosphate groups. So it looks very similar to what we call a nucleic acid. So nucleic acid typically only has one phosphate group and a five carbon sugar too, and then also the nitrogen containing base. So the purpose of ATP is it helps us store and transport energy within our cells. So we have three phosphate groups. Each of the phosphate groups are joined by bonds. Once those bonds are broken, that's how energy is released. So once those bonds are broken, energy is released. Cells can use that energy. And then if we break apart one phosphate group, it becomes adenosine diphosphate, meaning that there are only two phosphate groups left. So we're going to do a little bit of coloring on your notes today so you can see the different parts of the ATP structure. So first off, before we get there, number one, what three main things make up an ATP molecule? So if you said nitrogen containing base, sugar called ribose, and three phosphate groups, you are correct. And then number two, what happens when the bonds holding the phosphate groups together at the end are broken? So what happens when those bonds holding the phosphate groups are broken? Energy is released. So if you wrote energy is released, very nice. All right, so if you could take out four different colors, we're going to do a little bit of coloring. So on my end, it's going to just be the same color because I don't know how to change it. So we're just going to color on my end as one color, but for you, I want you to do four different colors. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to color your five carbon sugar. So pick a color as your five carbon sugar. And your five carbon sugar is referring to this one in the middle here. So label it as ribose and then go ahead and color it. So that middle piece is your five carbon sugar. Right? So once you have that, next we are going to color our nitrogen base. So our nitrogen base, choose whatever color you want, and you're going to color this nitrogen base. So this is what we call adenine, which is a specific nitrogenous. Oh, sorry. This is adenine right here. And this is a specific nitrogenous base. So adenine refers to that specific nitrogen base. Next, we have our three phosphate groups. So your three phosphate groups are referring to these over here. So choose a color, a lighter color preferably, and color your three phosphate groups. So these are your phosphate. And last one you're going to do is your two high energy bonds. So once again, choose a lighter color and you're referring to these specific bonds right here. So the bonds that hold the phosphate groups together are your high energy bonds. So go ahead and color them one color and then label them as your high energy bonds. All right. Moving on. So you can see that ATP has three phosphate groups, whereas ADP has only two. So once one phosphate group is broken, that's when it becomes ADP. So what happens when a phosphate group is broken? Energy is released. So you can see that the bond that typically would hold these phosphate groups together, if one of them is broken, you end up with one phosphate being released. And in that case, it's a release of a lot of energy. Right. So, what are some similarities between the two? So, if you said that they both have the adenine base, that's the green, And then they both have the ribose sugar. The only difference is that ATP has three, and then ADP only has two phosphate groups. Next, cells use a molecule called ATP to store and release energy like a battery. And the energy is specifically stored in the chemical bonds between phosphate, oxygen, ribose, or nucleotide. It will be the phosphate groups. So once those bonds are broken, that's when energy is released. And then here, the diagram shows the molecular structure of adenosine triphosphate. Which of these events occur during the normal function of ATP in the cell? So keep in mind, ATP is stored energy. So in order for energy to be released, the chemical bond needs to be broken. So A, the chemical bond between the adenine unit and the third phosphate group, that is not true because adenine is not touching, not touching any of the phosphate groups. So as you can see here, adenine does not touch that. Next, B, the chemical bond breaks between the adenine and ribose. So that's referring to this and this. Nope, not that chemical bond. That's not the one that holds the high energy. And letter C, the chemical bond breaks between the ribose unit and the first phosphate group. So we're not really talking about that bond there. That's not the one that holds our high energy. D, the chemical bond breaks between the second and third phosphate groups. So it's referring to this right here. And that is correct. So D is indeed correct. Right. So this is it. And then go ahead and refer to your notes if you have any questions.